Hello and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Clara So, Program Associate for Policy and Partnerships at the Initiative for MPTs, or IMPT, a project of CAMI Health focused housed at the Public Health Institute. I'm joined today by my colleagues Bethany Young-Holt, Director of the IMPT, and Madison Langerin. Christine Sue is also helping with some of our tech issues. I'm delighted that the IMPT is hosting this webinar today as a part of our Let's Talk MPT series, which is sponsored by the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, NICHD. This webinar series was launched over 2 years ago to engage experts from diverse disciplines across the globe to help address MPT R&D priorities and gaps to ensure the most promising product candidates reach end users. I'm really excited about today's webinar on diversifying funding streams for MPT R&D. We usually have about 4 of these a year, and we focused on topics ranging from vaginal microbiome, scientific topics, and today we're going to be talking a little bit more about funding and investment in MPT R&D. We have almost 100 people registered from across time zones joining us today. So as we wait for others, we invite you to type your name, affiliation, and where you are located into the chat feature. We also want to note that everyone will be muted during the presentations, and you can unmute yourselves during the Q&A. If you have questions for our speakers during the presentation, please use the chat and we will address them during the Q&A. For technical issues, please chat with Christine Sue, our tech host. The webinar recording and related resources will also be available at theimpt.org soon after the webinar. On today's webinar, we'll be hearing about the current funding landscape for MPTs, as well as how additional funding streams may be accessed in addition to current U.S. government funding. We have a terrific lineup of speakers with us today who cover the entire product development and more importantly, the delivery lifecycle, followed by a facilitated discussion. And as in the past, we look forward to an engaging discussion. One of the things that we really want to focus on is the fact that products, if they don't get into the hands of end users, will just be a really amazing chemical entity. And so that's why we want to have speakers and panelists from each of the life cycle stages, from early discovery and development, all the way through to how we actually get these products into the hands of women. On that note, our first speaker today is Dr. Daniel Johnston, Chief of the Contraception Branch at Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Prior to coming to NICHD, Dan spent nearly 15 years in the pharmaceutical industry, including at the pharmaceutical company Pfizer, where he led projects focused on early-stage drug discovery for contraception and developed translational research expertise in the therapeutic areas of women's health and oncology. Following Dan, also in the order of timeline from when you might see investment happening, is Jenny Yip. Jenny has worked in finance for almost 2 decades, beginning as an investment banker advising corporate clients in mergers and acquisitions and debt and equity financing at Goldman Sachs' Hong Kong, New York, and San Francisco offices. Jenny is currently at Adjuvant Capital, where she oversees the firm's investment in early-stage life science companies, in addition to managing the firm's operations and growth. She is also a fierce advocate for women's health and serves on the investment advisory committee at RIA Ventures. Thank you. So since launching the IMPT, we've been tracking the MPT pipeline in an online database where you can see a screenshot here. Over the last decade, support has grown for MPTs, which we're very grateful for, and an array of new MPTs have entered development, representing diverse delivery approaches and targeted indications. So as you can see here, we track all of them. As of September 2023, this month, there are 24 MPT product candidates in the pipeline. And the vast majority of these are in the early stage of preclinical or clinical development and are primarily focused on combining anti-HIV drugs and hormonal contraceptive drugs into a single product. However, they do cover a host of different indications, and there are many non-hormonal products also in development. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out the website, which is mpts101.org. And also, if you're aware of any MPTs that are not reflected on our database, please let us know. So if you go to the next slide, this one just shows a different, slightly different overview of the current product pipeline. And you can see most of the products are intravaginal rings in the early stages of development, but you can also see that there are products throughout the different stages using many different delivery methods. And many of these products are also being developed for multiple indications. Next slide. Thank you. So finally, before we let our speakers take it away, we just wanted to give an overview of the entire product lifecycle and briefly note that in which each stage of product development and delivery lifecycle, each of the organizations that we're going to be hearing from today generally work with. So one of the things we wanted to note is that the handoff between each of these entities can be challenging, and not all of the funders and investors work through the entire life cycle. So it's important for us to start considering discovery to delivery in its entirety early and often. If a product doesn't get actually to the hands of end users, it'll just end up as a really interesting chemical entity and not an actual product. So we talk a lot about discovery, we talk a lot about clinical trials, we talk a lot about regulatory, but we really also want to talk about the fact that these are products that have immense potential for public health and personal impact, and we want to make sure they get to the end users. Finally, we also wanted to note that drug discovery and development is a very time-consuming, difficult, and expensive process. If we consider the cost of failures, it's estimated that it costs over $1.6 billion to bring a new drug to market, excluding the cost of capital. So one of the things that we wanted to note is that right now we have a couple $100 million supporting more than 20 MPT product candidates. So while the field is extremely efficient and we're doing well in excess of what you would expect for the amount of funding, it's imperative that we actually start thinking about how to access additional funding. So let's go to the next slide. So as with all past webinars, today's webinar recording will be available on the MPT Learning Events Hub on our website at theiMPT.org. And you can also visit our resource center and find additional relevant tools and resources. So now I'm really delighted to hand over this webinar and to our featured speakers. And first up will be Dr. Dan Johnston.
All right, can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, very good. So again, my name is Dan Johnston. It's a pleasure to be here today to tell you about some of the mechanisms that the NICHD, specifically the contraceptive research branch, use to fund development of multi-purpose prevention technologies. And obviously these are going to be products which have a contraceptive effect as well as an anti-infective effect. So some brief background on the branch itself. We really have 5 areas that we focus on. The first is basic research to facilitate contraceptive development. This includes identifying targets and things like studying the blood testis or blood epididymal barrier. The second one is the development of new and improved methods for contraception. This obviously includes MPTs. The third is market and behavioral research to inform contraceptive development. The fourth is the effects of long-term contraceptive use on health. That's a very large part of our funding portfolio. And a relatively new one is the biological effects of contraceptive used as treatments for gynecologic disorders. But clearly, for the sake of today's presentation, these are the areas that are of main focus. Okay, briefly before I dive in, this is the contraceptive research branch staff. This is myself. We have 2 program officers, Chris Lindsay and Dr. Lee Allen. Ying Liu is a relatively new addition to the branch. She's a program analyst. Steve Kaufman is a medical officer, and Ayana Brummel and Maria Hill provide excellent administrative assistance both to the contraceptive research branch as well as another branch that also does some work on multi-purpose prevention technologies. That is the maternal and pediatric infectious disease branch. The other reason I want to put this slide up is to give thanks to Dr. Allen and Dr. Liu, who were both very important in helping to put this presentation together. So we're going to spend a lot of time today thinking across kind of the drug development pipeline, and I'm going to use this format to kind of do that. Really, the NICHD and the branch can really support contraceptive and MPT development through phase 2A. And the great question is, who is there and when are they there to pick this up and carry the ball the rest of the way through, as Clara very nicely pointed out. I hope that we have this and we have the ability to do a handoff around phase 2A to either venture capital or industry, this is kind of the minimum that I need, and I'm not really sure where this box should be placed. Ideally, this is what I would like to see. I'd like to see VC and industry getting involved as early as IND enabling studies. And what would be a disaster for us is if it actually looks like this and there is no handoff, right? And so what world we're in, I don't really know. The agreement between Bayer and Dare, I think, was very interesting about 3 or 4 years ago, must be now. I'm not sure exactly on what the timing was. And then, of course, Organon has done an agreement with Circle Biomed, really for something that is IND enabling studies or earlier. So those are both great signs, but they're very limited. And in the meantime, we've seen, I think, Bayer pull back a little bit on its women's health. We've seen Ferring close down the group in San Diego. Not that Ferring was into contraceptives, but I do think they were starting to think about it a little bit. So we're seeing signals that look good and we're seeing signals that look negative, and I'm not sure where we are. But ideally, the key message of these slides is there has to be a handoff. And if there's not, then it really puts into question why put in all this funding if there's nobody to take it and move it. But that's what we're going to discuss today. Okay, this shows the contraceptive research branch's pipeline as of right now. Pretty simple in this context. If it's pink, it's a female method in development. If it's blue, it's a male method in development. If it's a rectangle, it's a drug. If it's an oval, it's a device. And then we have some end user and biomarker studies going on. So I'm quite happy with this pipeline. It's changed a lot since I came into the branch in 2016. Now with the next advancement, I will just show where the MPTs are. These are all potential MPT products. The lead one in the phase 1, obviously, being the anti-sperm antibody from Deborah Anderson's group at BU, which has also been shown to have potential anti-infective effects as well. But you'll see a number of different products. All of them are female that are potential MPTs, and we can discuss why that is later on in the question and answer period. Let's talk about some of the funding mechanisms and how we try to develop an ecosystem to bring products through to hand off to venture capital or industry. We'll use this slide. Obviously, I start with the clinical evaluation up there because that is the goal. Our goal is not to perpetually fund programs that don't advance and that don't work their way through the pipeline. And we've incorporated some mechanisms to try to put some control over that. We use a number of grants that many of the people on the call will be familiar with, the R21s, the R01s, and we've recently brought in an R61, R33, thanks to some great discussions with Jim Turpin over at NIAID, who had used this mechanism before, and it's been a great mechanism that we can talk about a little more later. The bigger grants that come with either greater money or greater money per unit time are the P50s. These are our flagship programs. We are congressionally mandated to have 3 of these at all times. We'll talk more about the funding and the amount of funding on those later on. And then the STTRs and the SBIRs. We really like to use them for IND enabling studies and early clinical studies. I should point out here that this is the way we like to use the ecosystem. Things don't have to, in general, be this way. You can have an R01 that could do target ID. You could probably have an R01 that will do IND and formulation studies and so forth. But this is kind of how we think about the ecosystem. Then you think about contracts. We have 2 contracts. Again, we also modeled this after activities at NIAID. Those are the chemical screening and optimization facility, which is just what it sounds like. People can come in and solicit to have work done for chemical screening and optimization. And we also have the biological testing facility, which of course is exactly what it sounds like. And it does animal testing and some cellular testing to really facilitate product development. And you can see how these fit into the pipeline. And this is really how we try to work things to get through a phase 2A type trial that we can then hopefully hand off. Okay, so again, with the goal always being clinical evaluation on the right, some other things we've tried to incorporate recently in the grant phase, really to develop end user research in the development of biomarkers and diagnostics to really help these programs, especially the P50s and the SBIRs and TTRs. And the other thing, we've been tremendously fortunate, and I'm delighted that the NICHD has provided resources for this, is a group of consultants. So as Clara said at the beginning, it takes a lot of different skills to bring a product all the way through phase 2A. We have a really talented staff. but we can always use more expertise. So the ability to use consultants is a really cost-effective way to bring in really high-level expertise in these areas that are shown here. For the anti-infectives, that is Dr. Jim Turpin, who we're delighted to have, who does play a big role in all of our MPT development activities. Okay, now we put some of the dollar funding here. The R21s can be about $275,000 over 2 years. R01s are up to $500,000 per year. Those typically run 5 years, but they can be less. And I should say these are all direct costs. So these are actually all the cost that goes into research. They actually cost the NICHD more when you take the indirect cost into effect. The R61, R33s are a fantastic mechanism, and that is usually there's 1 to 2 years in the R61 phase, and there's a potential transition to a second phase, which is known as the R33 phase, where we can then fund up to $500,000 a year for roughly 3 years. This is a great way for us to allow a lot of innovative products into the pipeline. And if they get traction and they get moving and things look good, they have a good chance to advance to the R33 phase. And if they don't advance, or the hypothesis turns out not to be valid or not, we can stop it at the end of 2 years, obviously saving a lot of money on the back end that can then be incorporated into pushing the programs that really, really work. The P50s, the most recent is about $1.3 million per year. The P50s for us typically run 5 years, but we have done 4-year and 3-year P50s. And the SBIRs, the phase 1s are roughly $300,000 for 6 to 24 months. And the phase 2s can be up to $2 million for 1 to 3 years. So there really is some good funding per unit time for those. And obviously, with the goal of all these is to bring them up to kind of a phase 2, phase 2A, and hand them over to somebody else to hopefully finish the development. Okay. As Clara also said, she showed a data that predicted it was over $1 billion to bring a product to market, but she did say that took into account the failures. This data from a Congressional Budget Office report a couple of years ago said the cost to really bring a product through phase 3 trials is about $375 million. And again, that's not taking into account failures. So when you look at these numbers here, it's very clear that when we're funding really at most about $6.5 million. Let me jump ahead. Let me back up. Let me wait a minute. So we can fund at most about $6.5 million over 5 years in a P50. That's not enough to bring these through clinical trials, and that's why we need some help. So now I want to take a little bit of a pivot, and we'll come back to this topic to finish my last couple of slides. But let's look at the NICHD's current support of MPTs. So 2 of our 3 P50 flagship centers have MPT product development. These are from the Population Council. The PI is Lisa Haddad. They have a triple API non-hormonal vaginal ring, which has been shown to be effective against some infectious organisms. Boston University, as I mentioned, Deborah Anderson, the human contraceptive antibody film. The target of this antibody also incorporates into the membrane of some sexually transmitted infective agents. And so the antibody has an effect on agglutinating those as well. We are participating in several MPT-specific funding opportunities. These are shown here, as well as their next receipt date for anybody who's interested in those. Again, the PAR 23180 and the PAR 21268, PAR 21297. These all have upcoming receipt dates. The developments and work on multi-purpose technologies is also allowed within both the biological testing facility as well as the chemical screening and optimization facility. So if you'd like to talk more about those facilities, just contact me or Dr. Chris Lindsay, who runs the chemical screening and optimization facility, or Dr. Lee Allen, who is the core of the biological testing facility. And lastly, the NICHD also provides some funding in partnership with the Office of AIDS Research to the IMPT, which is supporting this seminar series. Okay, so now let's go back, and I'll just finish up with a slide like this again, and to show that really with the P50s and the SBIRs, which are our most highly funded mechanisms, you're really going to get in about the $2 million to $6.5 million range as far as total costs that can go in for a period of a couple of years to up to 5 years. But if you need $375 million to bring something through phase 3, that's clearly not enough. So how do we handle this? Well, there's a couple ways, and this shows the same thing again. We can get to about 6.5 million, 375 million to get through phase 3, 1 to 2 billion for total development. There just is not enough money available through our funding mechanisms to bring things to through phase 3 and to NDA approval. So what we really have to do is we have to all, kind of come together and discuss this. I've spent a lot of time since I started with the NICHD in 2016 trying to build relationships with pharma. That would be Organon, Bayer, Exeltis, Ferring. Delighted to see venture capital start to step in, and I'm delighted that Jenny's here representing Adjuvant. I think it's all really important, but there's no one entity that's going to really take this and bring it from beginning to end. And it's really our job to try to bring forward the most innovative products that venture capital and industry would be interested in, so that they will come down and pick them up and hopefully bring a lot of new innovation to the market. So we've done a lot, I think, to try to build these relationships. We have an annual or semi-annual contraceptive development meeting, which will occur in November. I would imagine Cami will be discussing that at greater length, but that meeting is going to occur over 2.5 days in November, and then there's going to be an extra half-day session specifically devoted to MPTs. And this is really a place where we want to bring the whole field together, try to create some new interactions, and really start talking about how we work together to bring MPTs forward into the market. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to taking questions later.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. So again, we already have some questions for you in the chat, which we will address at the end. And so I also now just want to hand it over to Jenny to take it away, not just as our next speaker, but also representing sort of the next step in that product development lifecycle. So Jenny.
Absolutely. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I recognize a bunch of names, so it's nice to see some familiar faces. So again, I'm Jenny Yip. I'm a managing partner at a venture capital fund called Adjuvant Capital. What we do at Adjuvant is we invest in mid to late clinical stage companies doing research and development across a wide range of diseases. So we're not solely focused on reproductive health nor contraceptives, but we are focused on clinical innovations that can be applied to lower and middle income countries. So that probably in itself is a pretty differentiated investment strategy for our venture capital fund. This is still an experimental fund. This is our first fund. We raised it back in 2020, but it is really with the thesis and the vision that we can't keep just innovating for products and patients that are only accessible and applicable in US and Europe and in wealthier countries. We have to do clinical innovation for everybody in the world, and not it serially, but in parallel. So we invest in across a wide range of modalities as well, whether that's a drug, vaccine, med devices, or a diagnostic. So this thesis really came from my time before helping found Adjuvant. I was also an investor at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Strategic Investment Fund. So knowing this world of kind of the nonprofit and also the venture capital world, hoping to bridge those divides, as Dan was saying, not just clinically, but also how to build a business, how to turn a science or a really, really great project and data into a company so that we can then pass it to Diana and the Organons of the world, is really how I think of my role in this kind of clinical development stage. So in terms of numbers, we had a $300 million fund, deployed that across 18 portfolio companies. So if you do the math, each of our investments was anywhere between kind of $5 million all the way up to a $25 million range. We, of course, will not only make one first investment, we will double down and follow on. And as with most venture capital funds, and what's also really important as we're talking about crowding in more capital, we can lead rounds, we can follow rounds. And what that specifically means is if you're a company looking to raise 10, 20, $30 million, while I may not be investing the entirety of that check, we're hoping to bring other venture capital folks around the table to crowd in all of that capital. And oftentimes because we are have a little bit more of a differentiated investment thesis, what generally ends up happening is or I, as the board member or the lead investor, have been trying to pull in others that may not be as familiar with the MPT space or contraceptive space to really help them understand the investment thesis or the commercial thesis by which we're all hoping to generate a return on investment. So that's really how I see my role as a conveyor of many different types of capital, as a translator sometimes of sorts between the grant, the Dan's world, and then maybe Diana's world, and the nonprofit world, and the grant funding world, and really helping to company build as well. Because while some of our companies are mid to late clinical stage from a data standpoint, they could be very early stage from a company standpoint. They may not have a chief financial officer. They won't have a chief medical officer. And those are some of the roles that our companies really need help in. Not only is it a really expensive role because you're going to be you're investing in these folks, but it's really kind of important in terms of technical and scientific and company building expertise. So I work in reproductive health and also outside reproductive health, but I feel like that kind of breadth of experience is really going to be helpful to all of you out there who are trying to build products and companies. Really happy to take questions at the end, and happy to work with Dan and Diana again.
So thank you so much, Jenny. And now again, our next speaker and also representing sort of the next stage in the product development lifecycle is Diana.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here. All right, hard to follow those two great presentations, but I want to take this opportunity to introduce Organon and then sort of go over a little bit how we think about innovation, that translation path that the previous two speakers touched upon. So I'll just take I guess you're scrolling, right? But next slide, however, it's just a forward statement. And so the next slide. So I want to introduce a little bit. So Organon is we're 2 years on, we're in a new kid on the block. We spun out from MSD. And as if you heard anything about Organon, it's that we're a women's health pharmaceutical company. But I think it's worth noting that we do actually have two other legs to stand on. It's the biosimilars biosimilar leg and established brands. And we are a global company, so we cover 140 markets, and we have a large portfolio of drugs that we took with us from MSD, and some that we have also acquired since our spin. So I'll take the next slide, please. Just to touch on our vision, which is every day, better every day for every woman. And I'll take next slide, please. Touch upon what that means to us. But where that all starts is that we use these two different legs to fund innovation in women's health and take in earlier projects. So we have established brands, are cash flow positive products that are already in the market. And biosimilars are also late stage products that we take into our pipeline, and we use that to actually diversify our pipeline from early to late stage in women's health. So I think that's important to know that we're using this as an engine to fund our growth in women's health and expand that into earlier stages. So I'll take next slide, please. So this is really what we focus on in women's health at Organon and our definition of women's health. And I really think when I transferred over to Organon about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, this was really attractive. So we have 4 cornerstones. So it's contraception, male and female, fertility. We have a large fertility portfolio, maternal and postpartum conditions. And I think we're one of the few companies that will take that clinical development risk. And Jenny will know because we have one of your portfolio companies that we acquired. In conditions unique to women, so endometriosis, fibroids, et cetera. But we also define women's health as broader than that, and it's diseases that disproportionately or differently affect women. So we also look at those opportunities. So this is migraine, autoimmune diseases, osteoporosis, et cetera. So we do have a broad definition of women's health. Next slide, please. And I think these next 2 slides is really, I'm preaching to the choir, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's really underscoring the medical need and the neglect of women in these cornerstones, and therefore the opportunity for us to fill that medical need. So I'm going to take the next slide. I'm not going to go into every detail of this, but I'm sure you know, and this as well. So maybe just next slide on after that. So really the way we think about ourselves is that we want to cover all stages of a lifespan of a woman. So from puberty and adolescence to menopause and symptoms of menopause and on. So we, and I think in the next slide, we have maybe a more, there you go. More breakdown of what we really mean with those categories. But really, we're trying to cover as much as we can with the little resource, with the limited resources or the limitations of the organization that we have. And we're trying to grow expertise in each of these areas so we are able to be that market leader in each of those areas that you see on this slide. And I'm sure with time those will get broader as well. So I'll take next slide, please. So this is maybe where I want to go into a little bit of how we think about partnering for us and what we look to find in the packages and how we think about innovation. I think we start with, and this is a little bit generic, and then we can go into some subsequent slides where we talk more about details. But really what we look for is unmet need and understanding of disease pathology and novel MOAs. So essentially, how do you fill a medical need? We always look for that. Where is the, what are we trying to solve for? We looked also, so we spun out 2 years ago. We don't have our own R&D department. That's a truth with modification. We did acquire a small company that was clinical stage, and they came with a small chemistry and discovery departments. We do have those capabilities in-house enough to do a lot of the evaluations, but we don't do our own target discovery and chemistry development. So what we look for when what you guys come with a data package is the validated targets and a drug candidate. So data shows that this will, there's some de-risking for clinical development from the target you're picking, and that the molecule is good enough to take into the clinic or has already been tested in the clinic, preferably. It's all about testing things in the right disease model and making that translation from basic science to the clinic and validating that translation in the right models. And I know, it's always said, models, we cure a lot of mice, but it's still, there is some safety of having good models and standardized models that you've tested your drug in to then continue into clinical trials. We do look at that data package. We're also interested, sometimes it can be novel MOAs, but it can also be about ease of administration. So innovation in drug administration that increases compliance, that makes this easier to take, that makes that just has a benefit over something that's already on the market. We are modality agnostic at Organon, and I think that makes it easier for us to find opportunities in this space. Therapeutic development in women's health has been limited. So the fact that we look also at devices and diagnostics, partially also digital, is allowing us to fulfill that whole value chain and serve women and in a better way. And the last thing we look for is differentiation too, and that could be through administration, formulation, novelty of biology, etc. And I think what goes without saying here is that when you do develop drugs that are for so outside, for example, oncology, and that goes for a broader healthy population, safety is as important as efficacy. And so that kind of goes very quickly into what we look for. And I think here I really want to talk about how we find innovation. And this speaks a lot to what Jenny and what previous speakers spoke about. It's about that collaboration of the ecosystem. We can't do this on our own, so we're dependent on basic research being done well, and that translation part being funded, and everybody in the ecosystem working together to, by the time the drug comes to us, there's been a lot of hands on deck and a lot of people have contributed. So maybe next slide, I think. Yeah. So this slide says following the science drives innovation, and as much as I agree with that you can't have innovation without good basic science. I think it's also important when you are starting off and trying to translate that innovation, that basic science, into a product, is to actually look all the way at the market and the medical need. What problem are you trying to solve? And then work backwards. So what I mean with working backwards is saying, what is the medical need you're trying to solve? Where is, there's lots of contraception out there, for example, but I think that this is like male contraception. There's none of that. What are the patients looking for? That will inform your clinical trials. And then by the time you think about your clinical trials, that will inform your preclinical development, which will inform some of the killer experiments that you're doing already in basic science. So it's that kind of thinking already ahead. If I want to develop a product, what does it need to look like? And doing those experiments along the way, even as early as when you're in the petri dish, that you have, and definitely in clinical trials. So I think you do have to have the basic for science, but science can go many different ways. So asking that killer questions and trying to focus it and narrow it in towards a medical need that you're trying to solve, I think is key. And for people to do that, and I think maybe on the next slide, you need collaboration. So it is about talking to pharma and asking, what is the medical need you're trying to solve? It is about getting help with everything from patents to regulatory to preclinical. What are the right models I need to use in preclinical if this is what I'm solving versus if that is what I'm solving? How do I de-risk things at each and every step of the way to try to find some kind of data package that will inform every next step that you need to take. And for that's all about finding the right partners and collaborators in the ecosystem. And for us who are at the end of this, for us to have good opportunities to find and bring into our pipeline when they're in clinical stage, and we're looking mostly for clinical stage assets, we're dependent on everybody else supporting that innovation and bringing it to that stage. So we work closely with venture funds, and Jenny and her fund are very well informed in women's health, but we're trying to get generalist funds to come into the picture. We offer education, we try to teach them why this is important, what the market opportunities, what are the medical needs, and try to get them to start to syndicate with funds that are already converted. We work with university centers and try to help them if they have innovation, to sort of inform and lend our preclinical development potentially. We work with other KOLs and generally across that ecosystem, because it does take a village to bring a drug to a clinical stage and on. So I think it's all about that collaboration and working together in the ecosystem. And I think that the latter part I've already spoken about is the modality, that we're modality agnostic, just to be able to meet the broader needs of women. But we collaborate a lot. And just next slide to bring up the team here. To do so, we do actually have a lot of colleagues that support that partnering and innovation, search and evaluate and transactions. So I sit in the R&D team, and I work closely with two of my colleagues and a broader team that reports up to us, together with our CSO, to understand that science, to support that science, and get the ecosystem to support that science, to bring it to a level where we can bring it in-house, which is around clinical stage. And then my colleagues from the transaction team, which are in the chief business officers vertical, help with that transaction. But we, myself and my two colleagues, Trudy and Parambir, were sort of the first point of contact for that ecosystem that's out there, and for evaluating and bringing in. So I think if you do have something, I'm happy to, please reach out through LinkedIn, or I don't know if we're sharing contact details here, but very happy to take a look at it, to give some feedback, to try to connect you to the ecosystem that we work within to try to support development of that product and yeah, I think that's sort of my sales pitch here. So happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much to Dan, Jenny, and Diana. I'm Bethany Young-Holt, and I direct the IMPT, and I am just so excited about this webinar and your presentations today. You have really highlighted how critical it is to be thinking about the whole pathway, the ecosystem, as Diana said, from preclinical stages of R&D to what is needed to actually bring these promising products to market and to the hands of end users, which is what we're ultimately working towards. So we're now going to be opening it up for discussion, the discussion portion of the webinar. And thanks in advance to everyone who has provided questions in the chat. To help kick us off with this, I am really excited to have our long-term IMPT colleague and friend, Ben Light from UNFPA on this panel as a discussant. So Ben, I'm going to hand it over to you, but with this question, from a multilateral payer perspective, what factors inform your decision-making to cover certain products? For example, some MPT candidates in the pipeline may replace existing, separately existing products into a single product. For example, PrEP and contraception. While pricing is still yet to be determined, how much consideration can be given to user preference, potentially improved adherence, and the possibility of greater public health impact versus price and supply chain logistics? So Ben.
Thanks, thanks, Bethany. Let me have a go at that. Let me start by saying, thanks very much for inviting me. It's really inspiring to hear Dan, Jenny, and Diana's presentations. Bethany, as you intimated, we've been talking in this space for probably upwards of 10 years, and we're really very excited about the prospect of the multi-purpose prevention technologies. Just let me say 2 words about UNFPA. I imagine pretty much everybody knows who UNFPA, who we are. And we're the UN Population Fund, and our mandate is to focus on a world where every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled. And in that, obviously, a key part of what we do is provide support predominantly to lower income governments to make sure that they have access to and the availability of quality assured reproductive health medicines. And in this space, predominantly our focus is on the availability of quality assured contraceptives. In that sense, we are, of course, wholly dependent on the work that the pharmaceutical industry has been doing over the past 6 decades to increase the availability of these quality assured products. So the work that we're talking about here, moving into the future, is something that we are very happy to be part of. But obviously, our role is, once those products are approved, available in country, we can procure them, and we certainly very much do that. In terms of, you mentioned pricing, I think it's fair to say that every year UNFPA dedicates in the region of $150 million worth of support to procure and provide to partner governments predominantly contraceptives. In that sense, the issue of pricing is something that's happening upstream. Obviously, we've got a duty of care to the donor partners that provide this support to make sure that we're getting competitive prices. We've got a procurement service that is based in Copenhagen that does that on behalf of the organization where governments request that support. So Pricing is of critical importance, but when we talk about pricing, we're talking about it more at the macro level rather than predominantly at the level of the end user. Predominantly, the support that we're providing is focused on, is channeled through the public sector, and predominantly the idea of that support is we hope that support is going to lower quintile populations less able to make contributions to those costs. In terms of the point you raise about user preference, this is absolutely fundamental to the work that the Population Fund does in all its work. It's all about rights-based approaches, making sure that individuals are getting the products that they want according to their needs and the evolution of those needs over the life cycle and as new exciting technologies become available. So it's certainly something that we are very interested in making available, but obviously it's the market that is defining what is available and the work that you're doing. So when we are making products available that previously we weren't making available, such as 15 years ago, contraceptive implants, more recently, a big focus on the 3-month injectable. In recent years, over the last few years, the availability of hormonal IUDs, that is when there is a critical mass of support for making these products available in the public sector in initially what will tend to be a small selection of lower income countries, and then we scale up from there. So the work that UNFPA is doing in this space, very much in collaboration with USAID, but it's very much to make sure that the products that are emerging that are of particular public health interest are available. One thing I should make clear is, as part of a rights-based approach, we certainly don't promote one method or product over another. Our job is to make sure that the individual is able to select from a broad range of methods and make their decision on the basis of what it is they would like. Bethany, back to you.
Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Ben. Yeah, so I think I'm sure we're going to have some follow-up questions on that. And I know that you're working really closely with USAID on a lot of this as well. So that's great. I've seen quite a few questions coming through the chat. So Brittany Barreto from FemTech Insights. I'm going to open it up, and you have some questions. I'm going to see if you wanted to just ask those directly.
Thank you very much, Beth. I do have a bunch of questions, and it may signal my ignorance to the topic, and but I'm really eager to learn, so please excuse them. First is, can we clarify who the end user is? Is it the patient? Is it the healthcare provider? And then is it US or low and middle income countries? Because I also just heard Ben say, well, first we'll go to LMICs and then to higher income countries. And I want to know how stuck are we on that step by step versus getting approval and funding by going to high income countries first and then LMICs. I think also in that vein is the patient's ability to choose a contraception a high income country privilege. That again may be my ignorance. Do women in lower and middle income countries really have that many options in contraception? Okay, thank you.
Great questions. I'll take a stab at some of those. So to your point, your question around, are these for lower or higher income countries? The MPT pipeline is quite diverse, and there are some product developers that are focusing on more of a US market or upper income market. And then there are others who are focused more on lower income markets. So I'll give an example. We're also, as part of CAMI Health and the IMPT, we're partnering with the USAID funded Matrix project. which I know you're involved with too, Brittany, and that is really focused on providing HIV prevention and MPT options for women in sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. So, but and then, you know, you also asked a question, who are the end users? So the end users being women, men, or healthcare providers. And really at the end of the day, our goal is to provide people with choice and with more options for to address their health risk. And you know, the MPT field really evolved recognizing women's intrinsically linked risk for HIV, other STIs, and contraception. Condoms are currently the only MPT that are on the market, and we're working towards providing people with more options. So I will hand it over to see if anyone else on the panel has more to add.
Yeah, Bethany, maybe I can jump in a little bit. And I recognize that as a more investor-oriented fund, I might have a slightly different answer than Ben. But so first of all, I think what I am always trying to do is not to make such an artificial distinction between a patient in LMIC and a patient in the US, because oftentimes women in general, or men, want the same things. They want choice, they want something that will suit their own lifestyle. I totally understand that access, affordability, pricing, all of those things can be very different, but I'm also trying to not make such an artificial distinction between those two populations. But I am always thinking about the patient at the end as the end user, not necessarily who pays. So that's kind of one point that I want to make. And then the second thing is, I think that the delineation is more sometimes about time. So even in lower middle income countries, we want the best of the best in terms of being able to have great science. And for better or for worse, the SRAs are still mostly based in the US and Europe. So most people will still want that US FDA stamp of approval, or Europe, or whatever it is. So there is that kind of slant towards the high income countries just because of the regulatory approvals needed. But going back to my earlier point about some of these parallel processes, and Diana's a really great point about wanting to make sure that whatever the business case of the end user is gets incorporated in each and every step of the way, even down into the petri dish. That's exactly how we think about in terms of product development. It may be that we're going for US FDA, but we're thinking about how is the product going to be used in South Africa? What are the constraints there, or China or Brazil, and incorporating that. So we're always thinking about product development as wide as we possibly can with the limited resource that we have, that a company has. So I hope that answers the question. And I'm opening it up to Dan and Diana to add too.
Those are great answers. I don't have anything to add on this topic.
No, I don't think, thanks. I don't think I have anything to add as well, except for that as a pharmaceutical company, we of course look at always at the patient, but we also do have to consider the commercial case of payers and how we're going to get, who's going to pay for this and how is this going to get reimbursed. I do think that if you are sitting as an innovator and you're sitting with, some new science, I don't think you need to, there's a lot of steps between here and getting things reimbursed. I think you can look at medical need. I think you really have to and think about what are you solving for with that particular innovation. But I think just to maybe not stress people out too much for developing drugs that are at an early stage here, I think reimbursement is a very complex issue that you can incorporate in your thinking just a little bit down the road. And I think you do need to incorporate that in when you do come to clinical trial design, et cetera. But
are
I
there
think it is,
reimbursement models for low and middle income countries, or is a reimbursement model only a US based market mindset?
Ben, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, well, I can have a stab at it. Brittany, thanks a lot for the questions. I mean, just to clarify, in terms of what I was saying, certainly the focus of the UN Population Fund and USAID in this space is very much on lower income countries. And in fact, over the last 15 years, we've been focusing down on fewer and fewer countries, actually. also because there have been countries that have been moving from lower income to lower middle in the process of economic development. So that's certainly a good development. I think perhaps I wasn't totally clear when I was talking about how we try and channel the support we provide. We try in a lower income country to try and work the government to channel that support at no cost to the individual, to lower wealth quintiles, so to the poorer people in a country. You know, across sub-Saharan Africa, there are upper wealth quintiles who are contributing to the costs of contraception and other, you know, health services that they're accessing. We've got big issues in terms of equity, and one of the fundamental tenets of universal health coverage is equitable access. So the point that you raise about reimbursement, I think, is very much in this space. And one of the challenges we have in family planning, in contraception, is it's very, very difficult to price products in a way that's compatible with rights-based approaches. It's very difficult because different methods are effective for wildly different periods of time, from a single sex act in the case of a condom to IUDs that can be effective, protecting against unintended pregnancy for 7-8 years. So it's very difficult to price, and in the context of universal health coverage policies, and often they're equated with health insurance schemes, and pricing family planning has always been a big challenge. Very often, family planning is underrepresented in terms of what is available through a health insurance scheme, also because there are vertical approaches to the availability of contraceptives, such as the initiative that I work with. So, guilty as charged in that sense. But one of the things that we are really focusing on currently is moving beyond what I think we could characterize as a donations model. We've moved beyond a donations model. All of the support that UNFPA provides in this space to lower income countries is based on a co-payment by the recipient government, by the recipient state. So we're moving away from where we've been. And I think at this stage, in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be more meaningful to talk about who's paying, who is the end user. But certainly in my conceptualization of the market, when we talk about the end user, the final beneficiary, we are talking about an individual, predominantly a woman or girl in sub-Saharan Africa, predominantly, but somebody who could be a named individual. Obviously, that's facilitated by working with providers, etc., but it's focused on the end user and meeting her needs. Thanks.
Great questions. Diana, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I feel like these reimbursement questions and payer questions, somebody from pharma should answer them. I really am not a reimbursement and person, so I'm not the right person to really speak to that. But I do think about sometimes, when you develop drugs, you can think about that. So for example, contraception in the US, if you're developing an oral contraception, just a pill, that is really priced as a generic. It's really cheap, and you're not going to get a lot of investment to develop yet another estrogen pill. But if you can find a business case where there's something very specific, something very niche, where you can have a higher price point, so that could be an orphan drug, for example, if you can find a population where your drug works, that's just an example, then you can get that drug on the market. And then you can broaden the population afterwards. So it's about just getting it there in the smallest, most niche population that you can find, that is not competing with a very broad, generic priced product base on the market. So, and that strategy that's very a generic answer. You have to find that for your innovation. But looking for a small niche population as that first entry point into market is always a good first step.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it makes me think, like what you're saying, by finding a potential market that's maybe more lucrative, if you will, can help offset the cost of R&D that can it can raise everybody's boat.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. All right. There are just so many great questions. So I'm hoping I'm following this in order, but Mackenzie, I'm sorry, Amelia, would you like to pose your question? I see that you have several, so I wanted to just hand it over to you if you wanted to ask directly.
Yeah, sure. I think I mostly captured it all, but in the chat. But I'm Amelia Mackenzie. I'm a scientist at FHI 360, and I think most of my sort of intrigue or questions are around sort of maybe the dynamics and priorities within CRB and then other sort of branches within NIH, and then I think also especially with your point, Dr. Torgersen, about sort of collaboration. I'm a social scientist with early training sort of in the reproductive biology space, and I often find there's this sometimes disconnect between these various parties that have to come together for a successful drug development project. And so I'm sort of always on the lookout for successes or sort of best practices or lessons that have been learned across the board. And I know the IMPT group has a number of resources on sort of social behavioral integration within drug development. And so just anytime there's an opportunity to talk to those, like you all on the panel today, about that sort of process and that collaboration integration, I'm always open to what you all have to say and what you advise.
Great, thank you. I'm going to hand it back over to Clara, who has some questions some other questions for the panelists.
Okay, great. So yeah, we did actually have a couple questions from within the chat and some that we had put together beforehand. So they sort of touch on a lot of the same topics. Looking at I think people are interested in hearing a little bit more about how to coordinate and hand off between the different sectors that we have represented today. What point should people be talking to each of you? And how can we make sure that we navigate the sort of fractured product development pipeline?
I guess I'll start. I'm probably the easiest because I can go from target identification probably through a phase 2A, like I said. So anywhere in there, I'm happy to have a discussion. And if it's a device and you think you can do something else, we're happy to talk about that as well. But the thought of a handing off, the question should probably go to the people that I would hand off, or the CRB would hand off to. So that would be Jenny and Diana.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there. Thanks, Dan. I think at the point where you feel like your scientific project or your innovation has a product and therefore could be a company is a good time to start talking to venture capitalists, just generally speaking. I think oftentimes I get a lot of pitches on, we have some great data, but that's great, but is that data going to be applicable to a product that will ultimately make a difference and solve a problem, to Diana's earlier point? And without that kind of, not necessarily data to prove all of that, but that train of thought and rigor, analytical rigor to think about whether or not science goes into a product, which then can result in a company. If you have that kind of figured out, that's a good time to talk to venture.
I think from our end, you can speak to us at any time point because we have medical affairs, we talked a lot to KOL, so we're interested in even speaking to academics to just have a chat, and if you want some input, how do you what translational models are good, or how do we think about development. But in terms of pairing, I think we're partnering, we're coming after when Jenny has and venture capital has sort of shaped up a company and given some money to get some clinical validation. Now, that's not true for all pharmaceutical companies. We're only 2 years old and we're trying to stand up the company still. Many, a pharmaceutical model can be academic collaborations. It can be, and we've also had certainly Daniel Johnston mentioned our Circle collaboration, which was a preclinical development joint venture. So we have done earlier stage explorative collaborations. But in general, we would go, our current model is to go with a clinical stage company. But we're happy to speak to everybody, to innovators as early as science and have a chat and point you in the right direction if we can.
Great, thank you so much. So another question that we had that we wanted to touch on, I'm going to combine a couple different questions into one to try and be efficient, is that we've seen actually broadly a surge of interest in women's and reproductive health in the US across the world, but we know that generally investment in these areas has really lagged. I think Diana had really highlighted that in her slides. And it's just a conundrum that we're facing as a field. And similar to that underinvestment, we also know that broadly STI prevention is underfunded, particularly compared to HIV and other disease areas. I spend a lot of time working in oncology, and the amount of funding that goes to oncology versus infectious diseases and STIs is really quite minimal. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about why we are facing these challenges and what can we do to address them. Are we facing issues where we have too many silos and we need to break across these to increase funding? Do we need to do more advocacy? How can we sort of make the pie bigger so that we can fund more of these projects?
Maybe I could go first. I think the problem for women's health is across the board along the whole value chain. The way you develop a drug is you need a basic understanding of pathophysiology, or you need to understand how the body works. That happens usually in academic centers. And then there's a whole value chain of translation, development, regulatory, and market conditions that need to work together. I think that every step along the way is broken in women's health. We don't have a basic understanding of how these diseases work. So what happens is companies that do get funded, for example, an endometriosis company, they don't understand what endometriosis is. So they end up doing research of venture capital dollars. That's not what VC money is meant for, because there's lack of data and there's lack of management teams who know how to develop it. I think FDA, we need to work a lot with regulatory and playbooks here. I think they're very, very conservative. So if we, for example, take FDA being conservative in by testing drugs in pregnant women, that's what they just didn't want to take that risk historically. But what that ends up happening is that pregnant women do need drugs, so they need to make that decision themselves when they're pregnant and need to take that drug because there's no data in pregnant women. So I think there's a long way to go with regulatory. Regulatory requirements also make it very expensive to develop these drugs, which then feeds back to lack of investment, because in cancer, you can do 3+3 trials. After about 9 patients, you know if your drug works. You have some signal in these chronic diseases. You have to run large trials, and especially in women. So that's hampering things. The fact that we don't recognize women's pain, women's suffering, women's needs, like STI, you're saying, people don't think that that's a medical need, and when people come in, women's health is not recognized. It's underpriced. So all of this together is a hot mess, and we need to address each of these steps. And I think wherever you can grab and start solving for anything will add value to making that value chain flow better. And this is, I think, at Organon, we're trying to address that on multiple levels, but we can't be alone. Again, it's about the ecosystem supporting all of that and that innovation translation to market. I don't know if that's, and there is improvement. I do see improvement and more awareness and push. I think I want to leave on a positive note because it's getting better, but we're certainly far off from oncology.
Yes, the ecosystem. We need to strengthen it. Anyone else want to add to that? Jenny, I saw you smiling a lot.
No, I was just going to say I really agree with Diana, and maybe one other point is, I'm obviously a woman, but There are very few of me in the venture capital space that has a natural and intrinsic understanding of what women's health needs are. This is a little bit of a side point, but I really think training the next generation of business people, whether they're men or women, to understand that this is an investment thesis worth investing behind is also going to be really helpful to building the ecosystem.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And I think just to sort of add to that as we're wrapping up, I think financial literacy overall is something that is needed. And Ben, I see your hand.
Yeah, no, I'd just like to overwhelmingly agree with Diana and Jenny. I'd love to be able to push back and say, no, I don't think it's like that, but I think it's exactly like that. I think it's overwhelmingly depressing how skewed things are away from investments in women's health writ large. Certainly the space that UNFPA is in, when we think about sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is the heart of what we focus on in developing environments, we've essentially divided it into 3 blocks. We've got maternal health, we've got family planning, and we've got gender-based violence and other harmful practices. At country level, we've got a lot of pushback. And to be quite honest, over time, there will tend to be a skew towards maternal health, and there'll be more investments, more traction in maternal health because it's less controversial, or it's perceived as less controversial. People don't want to talk about sex. They don't want to talk about all the things that are going wrong. It's a real struggle. So it's not a lack of will, certainly on the part of the team, UNFPA and the people we work with. But when you're not getting traction with a Ministry of Health or whoever it happens to be, at a certain point, there is a tendency to go for issues that are slightly easier to gain traction with. And I think in certain of those circumstances, opening back up to, okay, now we're making progress on maternal health, let's talk about family planning. It's not an easy conversation, but it's the challenge that we face. And that's really what we do need to be focusing on. And just to be clear, I'm certainly not saying that there's enough money going into maternal health. There's not. But the others tend to get pushed over to one side. It's a major challenge. I think the other thing is just briefly, when you talk about contraception itself and you think about the business opportunities, undoubtedly the family planning space, the market for contraception in developing environments is stymied by the fact that you've got very fragmented markets. So in the HIV space, you've got 2 large funding mechanisms, PEPFAR and the Global Fund. In family planning, you don't have that. We've got something that's emerging a little bit in that way, what's called the UNFPA Supplies Partnership, with a budget of somewhere a little over $200 million per year. Not negligible, but something that can make a market when used smartly, but the markets remain fragmented. And I think from a business point of view, the business proposition it's not straightforward. It's not easy, which is one of the reasons that we, WHO, other partners, are working on aggregation of needs so that we can make what could be a more attractive market proposition for partners. Thanks.
Terrific.
Maybe I can just add to that just one more about that pragmatic approach and just getting things on the market. This is maybe a Jason example, but for example, for women's health, a lot of reproductive diseases have impair fertility, and fertility, you can, there is a commercial case in the US, for example. So what a lot of companies are doing is they're just trying to get there and then, drug-free endometriosis approved through the fertility path. And then, and they show that if you take this drug, your fertility improves if you have PCOS or endometriosis. And that's just that one pragmatic step to just get it on the market, to get it to a broader population and avoid some of the regulatory and funding issues. So it's just that a pragmatic approach. And of course, it doesn't work for every indication, but if you can find that smaller, more pragmatic population just to get it, funded and to show that, get clinical proof of concept, that, there's always that path or option.
Yeah, I think that's such a very very wise guidance, Diana. So, so I think that, this has been just a fascinating discussion. I feel like we're just really at touching the tip of the iceberg with these issues and conversations. So would love to continue it, perhaps in a different webinar. In the meantime, we have recorded this and we will make it available on the website. I want to again just really thank Dan and Jenny and Diana and Ben for your time and just your really generous, insightful, insights that you're sharing with all of us. So as we're wrapping up, I just want to point out that on the homepage of the impt.org, we have a learning network hub, learning events hub, and this will be this recording will be there. We also have other resources. The IMPT is really here to as a service to people working in this field. So if you have any recommendations or other feedback, other webinars you'd like to hear, have us organize, let us know. Thank you very much again. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your days and evenings. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.